I think it's fair to say that every Space Marine force has more than a few skeletons in its closet, and this will be particularly true for the Legion Astartes simply due to their longer history. However, amongst the Loyalist legions at least, there is one who carries a secret darker than any other. The very first of the Legion Astartes, their Primarch was believed to be more gifted in war than all save perhaps Horus Lupercal. He may well have, in another lifetime, become the Imperium's War Master. Though they were a proud legion, renowned as the greatest in the early days of the Imperium, the Horus Heresy's end saw them embroiled in a betrayal that threatened to rip them apart. In their homeworld's case, it actually did rip it apart. The weight of this betrayal and their attempts to atone for it have been carried by their successors to this day, causing friction with other Imperial forces when goals no longer align. Collectively known as the Unforgiven in modern times, they are the first Legion Astartes, drawn from the destroyed world of Caliban, but now living upon a mighty ship known as the Rock, believed to be a remnant of their former home. Led by the Primarch Lion El'Jonson, commonly known as the Lion or the First, they are the Dark Angels. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to Legions, a 40k Stories miniseries. The First Legion were created in the Unification Wars, and whilst it probably had been early in the conflict, I cannot give a precise date. Given they were the only legion at the time, they weren't actually referred to as the First early on. Rather, they were believed to have been known by the Emperor as his Angels of Death, a moniker still given to all Astartes today. Because they were the first, the Angels were treated as the bar all future legions would have to match up to, and as far as we know, they remained the strongest of all legions until well into the Great Crusade. Either due to the privilege of being the strongest or being the first, a lot of experimental weaponry and archaeotech was granted to the First Legion for testing, with plasma becoming particularly favoured. Interestingly, this still appears to be the case today. Guess a few dabbids die hard. The Legion itself was divided into 6 components, or wings, known officially as the hexagrammaton. These existed outside of the usual command structure and had their members distributed across the various companies, but on the order of an elected lieutenant they would gather if duty permitted. 4 components of the hexagrammaton are believed to no longer exist. The Dreadwing, who focused on mass destruction through high-powered weaponry and whose members often formed destroyer squads. The Iron Wing, often tasked with extermination with lots of heavily armoured vehicles. The Storm Wing that focused on boarding actions, and the Fire Wing of currently unknown purpose. 2, however, still endure today. The fully Terminator armoured Deathwing and the fast-moving Raven Wing, though whether they've changed much or at all in composition since the Great Crusade is unknown. Their purpose has definitely changed, but we'll discuss that a little later. Unfortunately, our knowledge of what the First Legion actually got up to in these early days, as well as their leaders, is completely unknown at this moment in time. I can only hope that more information will surface on their earlier days, where I'm sure they won a lot of glory for themselves, especially considering they maintained their status even with Horus on the scene from pretty much the very beginning. Eventually, the Great Crusade would arrive at the world of Caliban, a tainted death world in the north of the galaxy, not that far from the Eye of Terror itself, close enough to be affected by it. There, they found the 11th of the Emperor's lost sons, and reunited the First Legion with the first Primarch, Lion El'Jonson. Rather like Ferrus Manus on Medusa, Lion El'Jonson was not found by humanity soon after his arrival on Caliban. We do not know what his early experiences were like, but as Caliban was directly affected by the malign influence of chaos due to its proximity to the Eye, it is likely that anyone who wasn't a Primarch would likely have met their end in the inhospitable jungles of the Death World. He was out there, alone, for about a decade when he was discovered by a group known as the Order, a group of warrior knights that appeared to be like medieval knights of ancient terror, but with more technology behind them. One of their number, Luther, bade his fellow knights not slay the wild Johnson, and instead take the nascent Primarch into their ranks, believing there was something different about him. Well, he was right about that at least. They gave him his name, which literally translates to Lion, son of the forest. No one said they were an inventive bunch, huh? Despite never sharing the secrets of his first 10 years, Lion was a prodigy like all Primarchs, and ascended quickly through the Order's ranks with Luther at his side, the two complementing each other well, but always remaining as equals. Though I do not doubt that both were mighty warriors, Johnson was gifted by the Emperor or his genetics with an incredible mind for strategy and tactics, whilst Luther was a renowned orator, as Johnson would openly admit in later years that emotional comprehension was sometimes beyond him. Having a great speaker like Luther with him will have done him a lot of good. Eventually, The pair petitioned the Order for a crusade that would finally see Caliban free of the beasts in the jungles for good, though Johnson still did not reveal his history with them in his early days. They got their wish, and within another decade the planet was cleansed. This would make Johnson in his mid-20s by my reckoning, given he and Luther had to take time to ascend the ranks of the Order. At this time, the first split between the pair appeared, as Johnson was appointed Supreme Grand Master of the Order, a rank above Luther, and though it likely did not show at the time, it's believed that it planted the first seed of jealousy within Luther that would flower over the course of the Great Crusade. Again, more on that later. Sometime after the liberation of Caliban, I did my best to narrow the dates down, but the seeming class of available information made it nigh impossible. A unit of scouts for the Imperium arrived on the planet, with the Emperor assumedly not far behind, once word of a Primarch got to his ears. There is no known conflict between the Emperor and Johnson, suggesting the first Primarch went along with his father willingly, and the First Legion was immediately given over to his command. Many of the higher-ups within the Order were elevated to the Astartes, assuming they were worthy and passed the trials, with many, including Luther, being subjected to a form of genetic manipulation rather than standard procedure due to their age. Not everyone within the Order was on board, however, and an assassination keeping against both the Lion and the Emperor was foiled before the Imperium consolidated its power on Caliban. The knowledge of said rebellion was suppressed. The now legendary trend of keeping secrets in this legion was already beginning to appear, it seems. With the First Legion now under his command, Johnson gave them their name based on an old Caliban legend that Luther had recalled on his first sight of Astartes with jump packs. When the First Legion took to the battlefield again in the Great Crusade, they were known, and would remain always, as the Dark Angels. The Dark Angels picked up pretty much where they'd left off once they had their Primarch back. It did not appear, at least from what I've been able to glean, that their tactics or structure altered too drastically from the pre-Johnson era, though that's not to say his return was ineffectual. Culturally, the Legion appeared to take on elements of the monastic knightly group that now formed a good chunk of their strength. The ranking system of the Order was implemented, at least in terms of titles. Captains were often known as masters, and there was almost certainly a high-ranking group known as the Inner Circle. If there wasn't, then we know at least that the Inner Circle exists within the modern chapter, as well as in the Ancient Order, though the origins for the Astartes seem grounded in shadow, so it may not have existed within the Legion, we're not sure. Lion was, of course, a fantastic strategist as we already mentioned, and whilst it would have been painfully obvious on Caliban, he was still incredibly capable on the galactic stage. The argument will likely never be resolved as to whether Horus or Johnson was better, but the fact that argument is even had should speak volumes as to his ability. That said, either just before or just after his return, again mixed up timelines not helping with the precise dating, it is known that the Dark Angels lost around 50,000 Marines as part of the Third Rangdan Genocide. Whilst this huge war was ultimately a success, if it happened on Johnson's watch, it suggests he wasn't as infallible on the battlefield as some may have believed. This was also the event that set the Dark Angels on the path to not being the strongest legion anymore, by the way. As we also mentioned before, he wasn't particularly good with people, and was unable to continue his close bond with Luther. To be fair, it was probably Luther's own fault. During wars or negotiations with a manipulative Xenos known as the Sarosh, an atomic warhead was smuggled onto the flagship of the Lion, the Invincible Reason, with the intent of assassinating the Primarch. Luther found and defused the bomb, but his jealousy from Caliban almost made him consider leaving it and letting the Primarch die. Somehow, Lion found out, and pretty much banished Luther back to Caliban to oversee recruitment before carrying on the crusade. Unfortunately, records of exactly where the Dark Angels went and who they fought in the crusade are largely unknown. In fact, I could only find one or two events that managed to make it to the annals of history so far. The only one to directly involve the Lion is perhaps the most infamous incident of the entire Great Crusade, the Dulan campaign against the Farsh, a highly technological human faction that honestly held a pretty similar mindset to the modern Imperium. Oh, the irony. The Space Wolves had officially been assigned the task of dealing with them, but seemingly the Dark Angels had secretly been put on the hunt too, much to Levin Russ's annoyance. The two barely if ever communicated during this phase of the campaign, which probably didn't help. The Dark Angels made it to the homeworld Dulan first, and there was a brief exchange of fire after the Wolves refused to answer hails, and though Russ officially apologised immediately afterwards, there was supposedly a whispered threat not to attack the Wolves again if the Lion valued his life. Teaming up for the final assault, it is believed by the Dark Angels today that the Lion had made meticulous plans that Russ threatened to disrupt, and so rather than grant the Wolf King the enemy's head, the first launched a precise strike that ended the war. The truth is that a member of the Wolves had been afflicted by the curse of the Wolfen during the battle, stalling the 6th Legion and Leman Russ. And after giving Russ an extended grace period without comms, Johnson decided to unleash a teleport strike suggested by one of his masters. Suffice it to say that Russ was not pleased in either case, claiming that Johnson had stolen his kill, and the two fought first with blades and then with their bare hands. Eventually, Russ stopped and laughed about the whole absurdity of the reasons behind the fight, but Johnson was just too slow to forgive and knocked the Wolf King out before the Dark Angels withdrew. This incident is known as the Lion and the Wolf, and is recreated in an honor duel between champions of the Dark Angels and Space Wolves whenever they fight together. It's not always bloodless, but there you go. Whilst this would suggest Lion and Russ did not get on, it appears their mindsets weren't actually that dissimilar, as both were in agreement that Horus's promotion to War Master was essentially confirmation of the Emperor playing favourites. In another lifetime, Johnson may well have been the War Master himself thanks to his record, but his taciturn, secretive nature kept him out of the job. He was not present at the Council of Nicaea, and though he complied with the disbanding of the Librarius, it's unknown whether he actually cared either way. He certainly was not open in supporting either side, though it is reported he wanted Magnus the Red to be censured, implying he didn't get on with the Crimson King. The strength of the Dark Angels toward the close of the Great Crusade is unclear, but I suspect they were still among the larger legions because, despite their losses in the Rangdan genocide, they'd only slowly been passed in stature by the new largest legion, the Ultramarines. Rather than attempt to seduce the Dark Angels to the traitor cause, Horus instead chose to distract the First Legion whilst he revealed the heresy. I assume his thought was that if he failed to turn Johnson and co., he'd be dealing with a very powerful foe led by a strategist as good as he was. As a result, at the time of Istvan III, the Dark Angels were fighting against the human civilization known as the Gordian League, and were about 8 months from a final victory when they received word of the treachery. In response to the news, Johnson and the small force he could spare from the battle moved to secure the siege engines on the forge world of Diamat, but then gave them to a still believed to be loyal Perturabo and the Iron Warriors. Whilst I cannot blame Johnson for this move, as the 4th Legion were siege experts, it is believed that a deal was struck with Perturabo to support Johnson becoming the next War Master now that Horus had turned and vacated the position. He didn't get it, it went to Dawn, I believe. For the whole affair, it makes me raise an eyebrow. Johnson then returned to oversee the eventual defeat of the Gordian League, but once the war was over, the first were drawn into a 2-year battle with the Night Lords and Conrad Kurz, known as the Thramas Crusade. Eventually, the two Primarchs met for talks on the planet of Salguasa, the world where Kurz would later be assassinated, and the Night Haunter revealed to the Lion his visions concerning Caliban and the fate of the Dark Angels. How Johnson took the news is unclear. It didn't immediately turn into a fight, but later events suggest he didn't believe it. The brothers did eventually come to blows after a slander from Kurz and a dishonourable blow from Lion, and both Primarchs were wounded, Johnson being saved from death by one of his paladins, an equivalent to captain or chapter master, though I'm not sure which. The Dark Angels eventually did win the Thramas Crusade, capturing several high-ranking Night Lords and causing the 8th Legion to splinter, though Kurz evaded or killed his pursuers whilst trapped on the Invincible Reason. With that done, the Dark Angels tried to head for Terra, but became lost due to the Ruin Storm, and their fleet was assailed by demons led by the legendary Kairos Fate Weaver, Oracle of Tzeentch. In order to effectively combat them, Lion overruled the decree of Nicaea and reinstated the Legion's Librarius. Not everyone was on board with it, and a chaplain called Nemiel was killed by Johnson when he refused to back down on the issue. Fateweaver and Johnson fought as the battle drew to a close, and though the demon tried, he could find no way to corrupt the Lion. Johnson was completely loyal, and there was no way for even the almost omniscient Kairos to turn him. With the demons driven off, the Dark Angels continued to try to reach Terra, but were drawn by the Pharos beacon to Ultramar instead. Johnson helped Guilliman and Sanguinius with the establishment of Imperium Secundus, but refused to lead it. Kurz took this opportunity to escape the Invincible Reason and go on a rampage across Macragge, and when Johnson and Guilliman finally caught up with him, they were only saved from Night Haunter's trap by the quick-thinking of barbarous Dantioch, who teleported the pair to Sotha with the Pharos. The Dark Angels continued to hunt for Kurz, causing havoc whenever they encountered traitor forces, but it took the establishment of martial law on Macragge from the First Legion to flush him out so Johnson could capture him. Lion wanted him executed, but Sanguinius and Guilliman stopped him with words and then by breaking his sword, and the Dark Angels were effectively exiled from Imperium Secundus in the aftermath. Johnson spent a long time after that conversing with the Tuchulcha engine, a sentient device that the Dark Angels had secured in the Perditus Rift. Callus Typhon had been trying to get his hands on the device as well. A detachment of Dark Angels continued to hunt the Death Guard first captain to this day. and it was thanks to the engine that the Dark Angels had been finally able to catch up with and ambush the Night Lords in the Great Crusade, due to its ability to allow for precise and borderline impossible warp jumps. Still not enough to pass the Ruin Storm, mind you. Seemingly having an epiphany, Johnson had to torture teleport him back to Sanguinius' throne room just in time to save Kurz from being executed by the Angel. I guess Sanguinius had a change of heart, though the irony of the role reversal is not lost on me. Johnson claimed, accurately as it turned out, that Kurz's visions of death at the Emperor's hands, via an assassin, proved the Lord of Mankind was still alive and that the Imperium still stood. Kurz was taken prisoner once again by the Lion, but of course he would escape in due time. Where Johnson's forces went between this event and the dispersal of the Ruin Storm is unclear, but I would assume that if they did not stay in Imperium Secundus, then they wouldn't have strayed too far from Ultramar. Well, they might have done, we just don't know. Elsewhere, a Dark Angels detachment and Starfort effectively bailed out the Space Wolves from death at the hands of the Alpha Legion in the Alaxes Nebula, but either due to a lack of division or simply a loss of knowledge, we don't know how many other battlefields they fought on during the Horus Heresy. The Dark Angels were unable to make it to Terra before Horus's defeat. Why the Blood Angels did and they didn't is unclear, but I assume something to do with them not being in Imperium Secundus anymore? Whatever the case, it is known that the impending arrival of Johnson and Guilliman's legions was what forced Horus to take the gamble he did by lowering the shields on the Vengeful Spirit, as the combined numbers and acumen of the 1st and 13th legions would have almost certainly turned the tide anyway. Johnson was understandably distraught over the almost death of the Emperor, and perhaps because of this, it was Guilliman who became Lord Commander of the Imperium, plus the reasons Johnson never got War Master, I suppose. Before leaving Terra, the Lion met with Leman Russ in the Imperial Palace, in front of the fresco depicting the Dulan compliance, though I doubt their jewel was on it somehow. Johnson challenged Russ to settle their quarrel once and for all in a fight to the death. Russ, perhaps for the only time in his life, didn't even attempt to fight and just stood there. And though Lion had the chance to slay his brother, he turned his blade so that the wound would not be fatal. For some reason, this pretty much buried the hatchet for the Lion and the Wolf King, and though I doubt the two would have ever been best of friends, at least they weren't going to kill each other anymore. The Dark Angels then returned to Caliban, or at least they tried to. The orbital defenses fired on them almost as soon as they arrived. Kurz's visions had come true, at least as far as we can tell. Luther, Johnson's oldest friend and ally, had fallen into the thrall of chaos and had turned his back on both the Lion and the Imperium. Lion withdrew and ordered a sustained bombardment of the planet before leading a full-on invasion of his homeworld. Just like Horus, Luther had received a power boost from the Chaos Gods, though only to Johnson's level as opposed to the Emperor's this time. And as the duel between the pair ground on, the bombardment began to crack the surface of Caliban around them. In yet another echo of the duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Luther was actually winning, and he mortally wounded the Primarch with a massive psychic attack. And yet, he could not deliver the killing blow. Just like Fulgrim in Istvan V and Horus on Terra, Luther realized what he had done, and the Chaos Gods were enraged as their champion failed yet again, sinking to his knees. The commonly held belief of the legionaries at the time is that a warp storm was sent by the ruinous powers, destroying Caliban almost entirely and scattering those who had followed Luther, henceforth known as the Fallen Angels. The truth is a bit more confusing and hints that the universe is stuck in some sort of causal loop. In the 41st millennium, a clash of the modern Dark Angels, Typhus, and some surviving Fallen saw the Ch'Ultra engine reactivated by Azrael, the current Chapter Master or Supreme Grand Master as the title goes. Azrael intended to scatter those Fallen who made it near devices, and were attempting to rewrite history by bringing the Fallen of the 31st millennium into the modern era. But he accidentally scattered all the Fallen on past Caliban as well. If your brain hurts, don't worry about it, it's confusing. The Dark Angels of the past, unaware of the shenanigans of their future selves, took over the largest surviving fragment of their now broken home. The area surrounding the base of the Order had been protected by force fields powerful enough to hold it together, and today it is simply known as the Rock, now used as a mobile base of operations for the 1st Legion. However, of Lion El'Jonson there was no sign, even though Luther was taken prisoner and held within the deepest parts of the Rock. As none say the Dark Angels themselves knew of what took place on Caliban, the survivors swore secrecy even amongst their own ranks. Today, only advancing in the hierarchy of the chapter will allow warriors to know what took place. The Deathwing and Ravenwing were repurposed to a new role, hunting the Fallen and keeping the secrets of the Legion. Only the Deathwing or high-ranking Ravenwing members actually know this, oddly enough, so some of the Ravenwing are hunting the Fallen without knowing they're hunting the Fallen. I just don't get it. Assumedly to keep prying eyes away, the Dark Angels complied fully, ish, with the Codex Astartes and are believed to have sired 3 second founding successors, though it may have been more. But unlike with the other legions, these chapters all stay in communication with one another, united in their hunt for the fallen. Some would say that the First Legion never truly disbanded if they knew this, and given the drop everything there's a fallen attitude the chapters, known collectively as the Unforgiven, seem to have, I cannot blame them for that. However, there are secrets almost no one knows about the 2 major players in the final battle on Caliban, Lion and Luther. Luther yet lives, a prisoner to this day, but is potentially insane due to his repeated claims that the Lion will come and forgive him one day. Azrael, the only known Dark Angel with knowledge of Luther's survival, would be right to assume madness, as to his knowledge, the Primarch is dead. But he isn't. Unbeknownst to all save the Watchers in the Dark, diminutive inhabitants of the Rock with almost pariah-like abilities, and presumably also known to the Emperor, of course, Lion El'Jonson is alive, sleeping within the very centre of the Rock. The Watchers tend to his comatose form, but seem either incapable of waking him or unwilling to do so, or perhaps both. Why the Lion has yet to awaken is also unknown. His wounds against Luther were said to be mortal, but if he was able to survive them, I'd have thought he'd be fully healed after 10,000 years because primal biology. Whatever the case, Luther believes his redemption is coming soon, and with the turmoil engulfing the galaxy, it's fair to say the Imperium could use another Primarch back to aid it, but we shall have to wait and see. For now, with the tale of the First Legion told, let us look at a few famous, or perhaps infamous, Dark Angels. Luther, sometimes known as the arch-traitor to those who were permitted knowledge of his existence, had a very tough life growing up on Caliban. The world claimed his entire family in his youth, and even his wife and young child. It was not long after this that Luther, almost certainly a member of the Order even if his rank is unclear, some say he led it but this would clash with his rise, found the young Lion El'Jonson and presented the Primarch to the other knights. Much of what followed you already know. The pair led the crusade against the beasts, integrating the other knights from other houses or orders into their ranks until the planet was cleansed and the Imperium came. As Luther was too old to be transformed into an Astartes by conventional means, he received an alternate or partial ascendancy that, like Corpharin of the Word-Bearers, left him much smaller than the other Dark Angels. Whilst he seemingly served as Johnson's number 2 early on, he hesitated when presented with the atomic bomb during the wars with the Sarash, and when Johnson learned of this, he banished Luther to Caliban to oversee recruitment. However, Luther didn't exactly follow this to the letter, and his forces joined up with Horus's Lunar Wolves and Callus-Typhon's Death Guard in the Zaramund campaign about 35 years before the reveal of the Horus Heresy. Johnson actually turned up at the close of the campaign and gave Luther a piece of his mind. He wasn't supposed to be there, and he was sent back home after being stripped of his fleet. Luther actually did stay at home this time, effectively running Caliban day to day alongside the forces he'd been sent back with, but it wasn't as simple as that. The beasts thought purged by Johnson and the Order were back, and there was a rebellion in progress led by disgruntled nobles and supported by Terran sorcerers. Unsurprisingly, given they had Space Marines on their side, Luther and his forces put the rebellion down without too much issue, and in the aftermath, Luther came to blame the Imperium for introducing the Terrans in the first place. This, combined with a fear of Caliban's destruction via exterminata if word of its corruption got out, saw Luther and his forces officially secede from the Imperium, becoming the Fallen Angels. Luther began to study the warp and its ways, seemingly becoming a psyker, or at least able to defend himself from psychic attacks. I suspect the power boost he got from the Chaos Gods will also have included some sorceress abilities. Once the heresy had broken out, Garviel Loken and the Acton crews of the Knights Errant were sent to Caliban to ascertain both its, and hopefully the Lion's, loyalty in the war. Whilst the Knights were unable to find the truth for certain and were forced to flee, the Watchers in the Dark allowed Loken to see into Luther's mind, revealing that his side was basically whichever one Johnson wasn't on. Obviously this meant he was on the traitor side in the end, and he was forced to deal with pro-Imperial sentiments at home, as well as forcibly massacre a force of Dark Angels sent to investigate how Caliban was faring and recruit reinforcements. Eventually, the Lion returned from Terra, and the boosted Luther clashed with his Primarch and old friend on the surface of Caliban. As we mentioned before, Luther actually did mortally wound Johnson, but as the magnitude of his actions was revealed, he seemingly cracked, sinking to his knees. Unlike the other fallen angels who were scattered by the M41 Tucholcha engine, Luther was not sent anywhere, but was instead captured by the loyalist Dark Angels. Held prisoner within the Rock to his day, how he's still alive I'm not quite sure, Luther is watched over by the Watchers in the Dark, and is visited by the only other to know of his existence, the Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels. Even the leaders of the successors don't know he yet lives. His ramblings or testimonies seem to serve as some mechanism to aid the Dark Angels in the hunt for the rest of the Fallen, but despite the efforts of every Supreme Grand Master of the past 10,000 years, he will not repent for his betrayal, claiming that he and the rest of the Fallen will be absolved when Lion El'Jonson returns. Even today, the name of Khor Swain is relatively famous within the Dark Angels, or at least the Raven Wing. Interestingly, it's not known whether he was actually part of the Raven Wing himself, but his blade is passed on to the finest swordsman within what is now the Second Company. The Deathwing and Raven Wing became the first and second companies in what was the only deviation from the Codex Astartes. In his day, Khor Swain was the greatest swordsman within the Dark Angels. I assume Lion wasn't counted for the sake of fairness, and he was part of the Ninth Order, elite swordsmen all who formed Johnson's honor guard. He didn't actually lead this formation, instead being a captain paladin as opposed to a master. That honor and duty belonged to Legios, even though Khor Swain was the better fighter and beat his master in a duel. Whilst we cannot know for sure what his origins were, we can assume that Khor Swain was on almost any battlefield the Lion took to, but his first record comes at Zaramund, when Luther was rebuked and lost his fleet. He was part of the battle on Diamat and played his part in the Thramas Crusade, most notably when Kurz and Johnson met to talk on Salguasa. Khor Swain was in Johnson's bodyguard alongside Legios, and when it all went south between the Primarchs, he seemingly duelled against Sevatar, who was renowned as one of the best in the entire Legion Astartes. Legios was killed, but Khor Swain was able to save Johnson from Kurz by impaling the Night Haunter's spine. He even had the gall to leave the sword there as a memento. After the battle at Perditus, Khor Swain was promoted to Seneschal, essentially the Lion's second in command, and he was tasked along with about half the Legion with tracking down Callus Typhon. He did succeed in finding the Death Guard, but took heavy losses against them, so we must assume that whatever his mission was, it was almost certainly a failure. Of all the Fallen active in the 41st millennium, undoubtedly the most famous is the mysterious individual known only as Cypher. The name is actually naught but a title of an individual within the Order on Caliban, known as the Lord Cypher. His role was to guard the traditions of the Order, ensuring they were always maintained by all members, and on ascension to the role the individual would cast aside their name and identity. Like much within the Order, this would become part of the Dark Angels Legion too. As a result, pinning down who the current Cypher is rather difficult, but we do know that the position changed hands at least twice in Johnson's time. It will surprise no one that the Crusade-era Lord Cyphers are anonymous, but we know that the Cypher at the beginning of the heresy had chosen to side with Luther, serving as a senior advisor. We also know that he was young, suggesting he may not have been in the role too long, especially as once his identity was revealed, he was recognized. We don't know his name sadly, only that despite his allegiance to Luther, he was an enemy of chaos. I believe that this was the Cypher when the Knights Errant came to Caliban, as he helped Loken and Cruz escape, but refused to join up with the Knights Errant, saying he would serve from the shadows, loyal but unremembered. This Lord Cypher was later killed by Zahariel, a librarian who had joined the Order whilst Luther and Johnson were leading it pre-Imperium. He had been present during the war with the Sarosh, helping Luther to defuse the bomb meant to kill the Lion, but probably because of guilt by association, he was part of the group sent back to Caliban. Becoming a senior figure in what would become the Fallen Angels, Zahariel eventually killed the Lord Cypher who had allied with the Watchers in the Dark, expressing surprise when he discovered his identity and was instated as the new Cypher by Luther in his place. As far as we know, Zahariel was the Cypher scattered by T'Chulcha, but whether he's survived the last 10 millennia is far less clear. Whoever he now is, Cypher has been a thorn in the side of the Dark Angels ever since the fall. He appears not to serve Chaos, but is definitely not a member of the Imperium either. This makes Zahariel a potentially likely candidate due to his non-traitor alignment during Caliban's secession. He's appeared multiple times down the years, creating trouble for the Imperium and aiding its forces in equal measure, even going so far as to assist the Dark Angels on occasion, but always avoiding capture from his former brothers. Most famously for the former First Legion, it was Cypher who convinced Supreme Grand Master Azrael to activate T'Chulcha in M41, supposedly finding allies in the endeavour from the Watchers in the Dark. Given he opposed them when they worked with his predecessor, this throws some doubt as to whether Zahariel is still actually Cypher. This is interpreted by some as an attempt by Cypher to rewrite history, as it were, though the potential issues that creates probably don't bear thinking about. In more recent history, Cypher and a contingent of Fallen actually came to the aid of the returned Robert Guilliman and the Terran Crusade, freeing them from capture at the hands of the Red Corsairs and the forces of Kairos Fateweaver after arriving through the webway with the Harlequin Shadowseer Silandri Veilwalker. Don't ask who brokered that particular deal because I don't know. Cypher and co then accompanied the 13th Primarch all the way back to Terra, where they were promptly arrested by the Adeptus Custodes. As he's always done, Cypher will likely break out if he hasn't done so already, continuing whatever his mission so happens to be, though some believe that getting to Terra was his endgame. Cypher carries on his back the Lion Sword, the signature weapon of Lion El'Jonson reforged after being broken by Guilliman in Imperium Secundus, and supposedly broken again, though I am not 100% sure. It was lost following the battle on Caliban between Johnson and Luther, and it is said that Cypher intends to bring the blade before the Emperor himself, either to present it as a way to seek forgiveness for the fallen, or to kill the Lord of Mankind. Given this possibility, it's of little surprise that Cypher was prevented from entering the Golden Throne Room on Terra, but whatever his objective, I do not doubt that Zahariel, or whoever bears the mantle of Cypher today, will not rest until their task is complete. To conclude, we shall look at a few tales of famous Dark Angels both loyal and fallen. The first is Astalan, probably the nearest thing to public enemy number 1 to the Dark Angels who know of the Fallen. He was a Terran, supposedly part of the very first wave of Astartes ever created, and by the time of Lion's rediscovery, he was already at the rank of Chapter Master. He was part of the contingent stuck on Caliban even though he wasn't with Luther, instead being accused of cowardice by another Marine following attempted negotiations on the world of Byzanthus. The Marine in question had been advocating invasion, whilst Astalan favoured diplomacy. Astalan was actually the one who gave the order to fire upon Lion when the Legion returned from Terra, not Luther, believing that the Primarch already knew of their betrayal. He didn't, as we now know. When he was captured, 80 years or so after the fall, later escape and be involved with Typhus and T'Chulcha in M41, he actually claimed that Johnson's odd late arrival on Terra wasn't due to any delay. The Lion was hanging back to see who won. Given Johnson was supposed to be incredibly loyal according to Fateweaver, I'm not sure if this is true, but I can understand his thought process. The one to, for want of a better word, snitch on Astalan on Byzanthus was Belath, a Caliban native and a firm believer in the idea that the Legion Astartes were built for war, and that was about it. He was part of Corswain's forces sent to hunt Callus Typhon, and stayed on the hunt even as that force fractured in order to bring word of the Horus Heresy to Leman Russ. Interestingly, the Dark Angels that did eventually save Russ from Alpharis were unaware of the entire affair. Belath was eventually dispatched back to Caliban by Corswain in order to check up on the status of Luther and co., bringing him back into conflict with Astalan. Though Luther was not intending it, Zahariel had Belath killed as an assassin from the Lion, and this meant his entire force was also massacred. Finally, I want to mention Nemean, who was actually a Black Shield and thus had abandoned his legion. It's believed he was a survivor from the Rangdan genocide that had been so costly, which may have explained why he left the legion behind. He and other Black Shields formed a warband known as the Dark Brotherhood, and they carved themselves out a pocket of space that became so annoying that an Alpha Legion task force was sent by Horus to deal with them during the heresy. Eventually, word of the Brotherhood and Nemean got back to Terra and to Malcador the Sigillite, who dispatched Nathaniel Garrow of the Knights Errant in order to recruit the former Dark Angel. He succeeded, eventually, as the Dark Brotherhood splintered into infighting. What became of Nemean is actually unknown, which means he wasn't on the Vengeful Spirit when that went down. But as he was not a former librarian to our knowledge, it's extremely unlikely that he became a Grey Knight. However, it is believed that one of the founders of the Knights, Epimetheus, could have been a Dark Angel based on a conversation/remark made to him by Abaddon following the Pandorax campaign. Unfortunately, as we do not know of any Dark Angel Psychers who joined the Knights Errant, we cannot confirm or deny the current War Master of Chaos' suggestion. So end the tales of the Dark Angels Legion. Whilst the First Legion lost its place at the top of the legionary pecking order, they were still undoubtedly amongst the most powerful forces in the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. Lion El'Jonson's sons may have been divided massively, but it seems as though the rift was mostly based around the Primarch himself as opposed to Chaos, even though the distinction is rather moot today. Their shadow past will always define the Unforgiven, even if most of them will never know about it, but they carry on the legacy of a proud fighting force and the first of the Adeptus Astartes. With this log completed, we're now into the final stretch of our Legions mini-series. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and will continue us for the rest of the last 3. For now though, it's time to end. Next time we'll be looking at those humans who've taken a slightly, or wildly, different evolutionary road, exploring their place in both human society and the Imperial military. Thank you all for watching, My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.